This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello and welcome to the 43rd episode of the Photographing the West podcast, brought to you by Flanagan Photos. My guest today is Justin Black, fine art landscape photographer, author, workshop leader, and businessman. Welcome to the Photographing the West podcast, Justin.
Well, thanks for having me, Kirby. I appreciate it.
I'm glad to have you here. You're well known as a fine art and conservation landscape photographer, but for those who don't know you for one reason or another, talk about yourself as a person and a photographer.
Well, as a person, I'm a husband and a father, a lover of art and music, a conservationist, a guitarist, and when I get the chance, I love to hike and rock climb, ice climb, and ski, although those things used to be a lot easier to do when I lived in the Sierra Nevada in California. Being in downtown Washington, D.C. now makes it a little bit trickier.
Yeah, I would think.
But anyway, I like to get outside, and mostly that happens on photo trips these days, more than it does at home. But
busy guy, lots of traveling.
That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes I forget where I am.
Could understand that. So one of the reasons I wanted to have you on was your article from Outdoor Photographer on the issues with tripod use in Zion. So talk about that and what you learned in the process of writing that article.
Sure. Well, what happened was that in the early, I guess in January of this year, suddenly I had colleagues and peers in the industry freaking out about this rumor going around that Zion National Park was banning the use of tripods, and that sounded a little strange to me, certainly baffling. And I started digging into it, and it turned out that the ban didn't apply to all tripods in general. It only applied to tripod use by commercial photo workshop groups. There was still a lot of misinformation going around about that, despite the fact that the park had tried to clear it up and express what the actual regulations were, and it was a case of the park probably not finding the clearest way to express that to the public, but fundamentally what it boils down to is that the regulations state that the use of tripods on trails by commercial photo workshop groups is not permitted, but that doesn't mean what most people would interpret that to mean, which is you can't use a tripod on the pathway itself. Actually, what the Park Service means by a trail, when they say on the trail, what they're talking about is the use area associated with that trail. So if they say you can't use a tripod on the Riverwalk, they don't mean the path, they mean the whole area that's accessed by that path, including the Virgin River itself and the banks of the Virgin River and all that sort of thing. So it really does come down to a ban of tripod use by commercial workshop groups in most places where people would want to photograph in Zion Canyon. Certainly anywhere that's accessed by a trail. So in other words, if you walk into a place on a trail and then go off trail, you're still not allowed to use it if you're with a commercial workshop group. There are some places in the high country, however, where or along the roadway that goes through Zion National Park from east to west, where you can use tripods within 100 feet of the roadway, as long as you're on basically a surface that isn't fragile or sensitive. So in other words, if you're in a gravel wash or on slick rock or that sort of thing with a workshop group, it's okay to use tripods there. But then there are other things like they don't want you going into canyons that have any petroglyphs or pictographs or anything like that. And then once you get more than 100 feet off the road, the designated wilderness begins, and no commercial guiding is permitted in the wilderness at all there. So it gets a little complicated. But the good news is that for independent photographers just traveling on their own or with friends in a non-commercial context, you can use your tripod anywhere you want, as long as it's not an area that's closed to the public in general.
And you're not blocking the path, I suppose.
Oh no, individuals can block the path with their tripod. That just comes down to common courtesy more than anything else. But as far as park regulations are concerned, you can technically, I guess, put a tripod on a trail.
So this is kind of part of the parks being loved to death, I guess.
Absolutely. The Utah parks in particular, the state of Utah has engaged in a very, very successful PR campaign promoting their wonderful parks. And they are wonderful, and they've drawn in a tremendous number of tourists from around the country and around the world. So Zion National Park went from, I think its previous record for attendance in a year was about 3 million. And last year, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but they hit 4.5 million in a year, which is a radical increase. And it's a park that it funnels people into very narrow corridors, so it just exacerbates the problem of crowding.
Right.
And while we used to operate workshops there from time to time, as much as I love Zion, it's a place where I really won't take groups anymore. It's just too crowded, and obviously the tripod regulations make it sort of a non-starter for landscape photography.
Sure. Yeah, that's actually similar to the numbers that Yellowstone gets, and that's, I don't know what it's several times, probably several orders of magnitude larger than Zion is, at least the
Sure.
Zion Canyon.
Right. Now, it's a lot easier to spread out in Yellowstone than in Zion, that's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on. So earlier in your career, you worked for Galen Rowell, who's one of my personal heroes when I was starting out in landscape photography. So talk about that experience and your experiences photographing Eastern Sierra.
Sure. I'll start by saying that Galen was one of my personal heroes going way back. I was probably about 13 or so when I first discovered his work, which was very shortly after I started getting seriously into photography. And Outdoor Photographer had just started up, and he was one of their initial columnists, and I devoured his columns and read all of his books and all that sort of thing, and never imagined I'd end up working for him. But sure enough, 12 years later, a good friend of mine who was an art director at my primary stock agency let me know that Galen and Barbara were looking for someone to manage their marketing and licensing of their image collection. And it was pretty simple. I applied for the job. I got a call back from their general manager, who set up a call with Galen, and we talked for a bit, and then he invited me out for a face-to-face interview, and I flew out to California, and we met in their office. And a month later, I was living in Berkeley, and the rest, as I say, is history. But very quickly, he discovered that I sort of knew what I was doing when it came to photography too, and so he invited me to assist in his workshop program. That ended up being during my time at Mountain Light, I was there for 10 years. The workshops were certainly one of my very favorite aspects of the job, and we had a lot of repeat clients who are still workshop clients of mine today, actually. But we started out in Emeryville, California, which is right between Berkeley and Oakland. Had a wonderful gallery space there, and a great space for workshops and events and all that sort of thing. After a couple of years, Galen and Barbara had bought a second home on the east side of the Sierra Nevada in Bishop, California, where Galen had actually tried to relocate in 1979, but he wasn't able to make it work in the days before FedEx and the internet and email and all that sort of thing. After some time there, they decided that, I guess Barbara in particular sort of fell in love with the community, and she'd been a real sort of Bay Area girl. And they discovered that there was this big, beautiful bank building right on Main Street on Highway 395 in downtown Bishop that had been vacant for some time, and Barbara told Galen, hey, we could buy this building and put a gallery in it. And Galen said, really? We could do that? So sure enough, they bought the bank building, and it was a beautiful 5,000 square foot gallery, just a beautiful space. It very quickly became clear that it was going to be a much better location for a retail gallery and a great location for workshops, and pretty much everything else we did you could sort of do from anywhere. So they decided to consolidate the business over there, and they invited me over to be the general manager. And at first I wasn't going to do it just because I sort of liked the Bay Area, and I liked being closer to I had a lot of friends, and I liked being close to the coast and all that sort of thing. And Bishop, if you've ever been there, it's a great town, but it's a small town in the middle of nowhere. It's 4 hours basically to a major airport any way you go. And so anyway, I was reluctant to accept their offer, but I did agree to come over for 3 months to fundamentally help train staff and ultimately my replacement. And when in the course of doing that, I was actually my guest in their house, and I learned very quickly that when Galen would come and knock on my door gently in the morning at about 5:30, and he'd say, "Justin, coffee," that the smart thing to do was to get up, go have coffee with Galen, because I knew that if I did that, we'd end up going out and doing something cool. So we'd go out for a hike together, photograph, first light. He'd been loaned a radio telemetry set by some local biologists for tracking collared mountain lions and bighorn sheep and things like that. We just go out and sort of have fun, or just go out bouldering in the buttermilk boulders or something like that. That was a time when we sort of made that transition from the employee-employer relationship to really being friends. And, unfortunately, that was just a few months before Galen and Barbara died in a plane crash. Coming back into Bishop from a trip circumnavigating the Bering Sea with Franz Lanting, basically teaching a photography workshop on a ship up there. And they, suddenly they were gone. We sort of had to figure out, what to do. They hadn't made any plans for what they would want to happen with, the company in the event they both died. The family members and that sort of thing, were obviously unprepared for this eventuality, really, and we sort of had to come up with a plan, and we tapped into some friends of Galen's, people in from various fields who sort of knew all the aspects of who Galen was and the things that he was into that were important to him and to Barbara. And we sort of came up with a plan for how Mountain Light could continue. And fortunately, everyone was interested in seeing their legacy carry on. So we set about sort of planning for the future, which involved creating a space in the gallery for exhibition of other photographers' work, since Galen wasn't going to be producing anything new. And before, he and Barbara had been 100% of the creative input into the business, basically. Now we were hosting exhibits by photographers and some other artists from the Eastern Sierra, and also some of Galen's leading peers, like Pat O'Hara and Franz Lanting, Jack DeKinga, people like that. And then we also sort of reinitiated the workshops program using some of the very same people, as well as John Shaw and people like that. Managed to produce some pretty what I think are really valuable legacy projects. We published a book called Galen Rowell: A Retrospective that featured essays by sort of, again, friends and peers who knew the various aspects of Galen. Galen the climber, the dirtbag climber. Galen the sort of the serious high mountain mountaineer, Galen the photographer, Galen the writer, Galen the conservationist. His conservation was a big part of what he was all about. Galen the athlete. And we also established two nonprofits, one of which was the Rowell Fund for the Art of Adventure, which basically funded young up-and-coming photographers and adventurers who were fundamentally doing things that Galen would have thought were cool. And then also the Rowell Fund for Tibet that was primarily intended to fund Tibetans throughout the Tibetan diaspora, both within Tibet and abroad, who were doing things in some sort of communication field, basically to help Tibetans get their own story out as opposed to relying on Western surrogates. And there were a few other things too, but anyway, I was there for 7 years after Galen and Barbara died, and after that time, I sort of felt like I'd done about everything I could do for the business, and there were certain limitations or restrictions on what I could do beyond that for reasons I won't get into. But so I sort of felt like I could do I'd done what I could do, and it was time to move on. At which point I ended up being recruited by the International League of Conservation Photographers for another phase of my career.
Okay.
But working for Galen was certainly an enlightening and inspiring and transformative part of my life. And he was a fountain of energy and one of the hardest working people I've ever met. And he could be really difficult to work for, and there were a lot of people who tried to work with him and couldn't, and they moved on to other things. And somehow, I don't know, I just had the right temperament, I guess, to sort of put up with his personality quirks and whatever. But what a guy! I mean, he was just anecdotally, I'll just tell you one story about his fitness level. He was, when he died, he was just about to turn 62, and I believe it was either that year or the year before. He came into work around noon, which was a little odd. Normally he was there, unless he was traveling. He came into work at 9 a.m., pretty much on the dot. And so I asked him, so Galen, why are you late for work? And he said, oh well, this morning, Peter Croft, who was a local climber in Bishop, and I woke up and decided to drive down to Mount Whitney. And so we got to the trailhead about 4 a.m. and sort of, did the North Gully approach to the east face of Whitney. We free soloed the east face and then trail ran back down the main trail to the car. And, this is usually people would take a day just to hike up to the east face, and then they'd climb the east face and, hike off, and it would be a long day coming out. You're talking basically about a 2-day enterprise, and they tackled it in the morning, and here he is showered and shaved and looking fresh as can be. And, he was 61 when he did that. So just to give you an idea, he was a real powerhouse.
Yeah. Amazing guy.
Yeah. And honestly, honestly, I just wanted to say this. I almost think he was a better writer even than he was a photographer. I have to say that, looking back on the books he produced, there's one from 1970, that came out in 77, something like that, about the 1975 K2 expedition, where he was the official expedition photographer. It's a tremendous book. He was about 35 years old when the expedition happened, and he managed to tell a very, very honest account of this failed major mountaineering expedition, while weaving in beautifully the history of exploration and mountaineering in the Karakoram Himalaya in Pakistan. And it's just a brilliant book. And when he was fairly young, and unfortunately he didn't have an opportunity to complete the last book he was working on, which I was really excited about. But it actually, the working title for that book ended up inspiring the name of my company. It was going to be called The Visionary Wilderness. and it was all about basically how what we can learn from the cognitive sciences can be applied to photography. So basically getting into really how we see what's going on in our brains when we interpret visual information, and how understanding those things can basically make our photography better. And he had all sorts of working drafts and half-finished chapters and all this sort of thing. And the science was changing so fast, he'd have to go back and rework something or do more, research into areas that he thought he already understood. And so he wasn't ever quite able to finish it. But that's a great loss to all of us, unfortunately.
Yeah. For those that don't even know who Galen Rowell was, I'll put some references in the show notes for his books. He took some extraordinary photographs back in the days when shooting with film and not very good film and not very fancy cameras, but managed to overcome all those obstacles to get some great photos, in my opinion, anyway.
Absolutely, especially in the context of the time. Yeah.
Right. And for those that don't know the Bishop area, it's a great area for fall color. It's not as expansive, I guess, as Colorado, but there's lots of canyons north and south of Bishop, which you can drive up into or hike even further up into to take you up into some glorious mountain territory with beautiful colors. So if you're tired of going to Colorado or you want a different experience, it's a great place to go.
That's for sure. Yeah, with the Sierra Nevada on one side and the White Mountains on the other. It's in America's deepest valley. 4,000 feet is the valley floor, and the peaks are 14,000 feet on either side. One thing it has on Colorado is way fewer fences and no trespassing signs.
Yeah, I guess that's true. All right, I hadn't thought about that. Well, moving along, talk about your time with the International League of Conservation Photographers.
Sure. Yeah. So the International League of Conservation Photographers was founded in 2005 at a World Wilderness Congress in Alaska. And basically what happened was there was a meeting of photographers, and they sort of said, there's no organization that represents photographers working in conservation. And hands went up, basically, do you think we should start something? And hands went up, and they chose sort of a founding executive director on the spot and that sort of thing. And of course, they had no funding. So it took a few years for them to figure out what the organization was going to be, what its, really what its capabilities or mission would be, and where to get funding. And by it was 2009, they had been gifted basically a conservation book series that was sponsored by Cemex, which is the second largest cement company in the world, in Mexico. And they had been long funding a conservation book series that had been produced by a Mexican photographer named Patricio Robles Hill. And Patricio had been doing it for years, and he sort of was moving on to other things, and handed over this conservation book project to ILCP. So suddenly ILCP had a major conservation communications project in their hands that came with funding, and the funding would allow them to fund general operations and support other initiatives as well. But they were looking for somebody who had some management background and had good connections in the conservation photographer community, and some of the members basically recommended me, and we started talking about me coming on, and it just happened. It was right around the same time that I was thinking about moving on from Mountain Lights, so that worked out nicely. But ILCP, what it has become is really quite remarkable. When I was there, we had basically these rapid response initiatives where we would work with conservation NGOs in various places around the world, where they'd identified generally a very timely and pressing issue. and that would benefit from very detailed, thorough, and rapid coverage. We put together a team of photographers drawn from the fellowship of ILCP, put them on the ground in the location to do intensive coverage, and then make the images available to the NGO for their communications campaign, and also potentially get the work out through the media and that sort of thing. And just while I was there, which was only about 2 years, we stopped a mountaintop removal coal mine at in the Flathead River Valley watershed in southeastern British Columbia. We stopped 2 massive dam projects on 2 wild rivers in central Patagonia. We did a large-scale rave that called attention of the Mexican news media and government to various threats to ecosystems across the Yucatan Peninsula. Did one for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation that basically addressed a whole array of threats to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We helped stop a pipeline through British Columbia's Great Bear Rainforest, and we helped secure protections for the what's called the Sacred Headwaters area of 3 of British Columbia's most important salmon rivers, which are the Stickey, the Skeena, and the Nass. And I actually was fortunate enough to be able to contribute some photographic coverage to the Flathead, Yucatan, and Chesapeake raves, and also did an assignment for the Nature Conservancy on the Dragon Run cypress swamp on Virginia's Middle Peninsula. And that was 8 years ago, and since then they've carried on, with a whole array of these projects. And then, also I was there, we published 2 of these conservation book series books, The Wealth of Nature and Freshwater, which were both independent publisher award winners, and the book on the national parks and that sort of thing. And ILCP now, they have a program called Wild Speak, which is for video or film as well. So they do both stills and video. And it's it's an ever evolving, ever changing organization, but it's I think its role is really important, and there's a lot of potential there for conservation NGOs to benefit from what they have to offer.
So is it open to any photographer or by invitation, or how does that work?
It's by application, and they have a very strict set of criteria, which they take very seriously, and it's not easy to get in unless you're really a bona fide photographer who's got ongoing conservation projects, existing relationship with conservation NGOs and that sort of thing. So it's not just a situation of paying your dues and you're in. It's you have to sort of be legit, as they say.
Okay, I see. So after you left there, you founded Visionary Wild, I guess, in 2011?
Yes.
And how did that happen?
Well, basically, I got tired of managing an NGO with a lot of internal politics and that sort of thing, and was tired of being in the office rather than out in the field. And I realized that while I really believed in what the organization was doing, personally I missed the teaching I'd done in the Mountain Light Workshop program, and frankly I missed spending time with a lot of the workshop instructors I'd collaborated with, as well as regular workshop clients, many of whom had become good friends, and missed time just out in the field photographing. I figured I'd already sort of rebuilt the workshop program at Mountain Light, so I just decided to do it again. A little more broad array of offerings, including international destinations, and in the process, it was really important to me to focus on key components of both the workshops and international expeditions that enhance the overall quality of the experience for our clients. And a lot of the photographers that I worked with at Mountain Light have continued working with us through Visionary Wild, like Jack Kinga, John Shaw, Franz Lanning, Daisy Gillardini, Michelle Westmoreland, Michael Melford, Art Wolf, Tom Mangelson, Daniel Beltra, Chris Linder, Roy Toft, and I could go on. But they're all just great great people, great teachers, pleasure to work with, and we have a lot of fun. And we have a great repeat client rate. A lot of our programs are 50 to 100% repeat clients, and we have people between Visionary Wild and Mountain Light. I've got clients who have done, certainly more than a dozen or 15 workshops and trips with me. So it's very rewarding to watch people sort of evolve, see their photography grow, and over a period of time, and just really know that you've been a part of the process of mentoring them.
Yeah, that's quite a recommendation for your workshops, I would say. So what's your role besides being the workshop leader?
I've realized, looking back on my career, that I've generally worn a lot of hats simultaneously. So, I co-lead about, off the top of my head, let's say half of our workshops and expeditions every year. And fortunately, I've got instructors that I trust and who I know take good care of people and that sort of thing, who I can trust to lead a trip without me there. But I'm personally involved in the design of all of our itineraries, in collaboration with the other instructors and our director of operations, various partners we work with on the ground to handle logistics and that sort of thing. And I'm the chief bottle washer, I guess. But I'm constantly juggling lots of projects. There's always a lot going on here, that's for sure.
Yeah, sounds like it. Since your time in the Eastern Sierra, you've become a world traveler, partly through Visionary Wild, I gather. Mm-hmm. So aside from the workshop aspects, how does that fit into your life and your business model?
Traveling. Well, I guess compared to my kids, who are 2 and 8 years old, who have both traveled pretty extensively in Latin America, Europe, and Asia, I came relatively late to international travel, but I've always been really curious about faraway places and just sort of the planet in general, and cultures and wildlife, ecosystems, that sort of thing. I spent 2 summers studying abroad in the UK and Spain when I was in high school, but that was sort of it for international travel until after I was, working. I entered the industry and got a contract for my first stock agency and moved overseas specifically to do travel photography. I just think that international travel is so immensely important to forming a healthy, informed worldview. We learn so much from experiencing other cultures and customs, traditions, landscapes, ecosystems, history. Very quickly becomes obvious that humans everywhere are basically the same. And we, of course, tend to magnify and focus on the small cultural differences that stand out most to us. But mostly those are superficial. And so one of my mottos is, most people are mostly good most of the time. And I think it's basically true. And for all the drama about violence and tragedy in the world, it's really pretty amazing that humans around the globe tend to be civil, compassionate, and helpful, even to strangers and foreigners. And the grand majority of people everywhere want to live a happy and healthy life, raise and educate their kids, stay out of trouble, and if possible, leave the world a little better than they found it in one way or another. And beyond that, as you travel more and more, you start to realize just how very small and fragile the planet is, and how immensely beautiful it is on scales large and small. And I try to capture and share that beauty in my work, and love to help others do the same thing.
I'd have to say that you've been to places based on the photos of yours that I looked at that I'd never even heard of, let alone been to. So how do you find these remote locations, beautiful locations, and how do you decide which ones are worth pursuing?
That's the trick, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. The world has, in my lifetime, has opened up tremendously. When I was young, you couldn't even go to China. You couldn't you couldn't easily travel to the Soviet Union. There were all sorts of places where either couldn't go or most people wouldn't go, whether because they were either legitimately dangerous or perceived to be dangerous or whatever. And now I think through one of the upsides of globalization and improved communications through the internet and all that sort of thing is that so much more of the world is, it's generally safer, generally more familiar, generally, but we're more familiar with them and they're more familiar with us, and therefore there's less likely to be animosity between different nationalities and all that sort of thing. And of course it's easier to research locations, and you get on Google Earth and you can actually, I once got on Google Earth and saw my driveway, or my car parked in my driveway.
Yeah.
It's amazing the resources we have now. But in terms of how to identify places that will be good destinations for photo trips, that will be sort of rewarding for our clients and that sort of thing, a lot of that just comes from devouring a lot of information through various media, talking to friends and who have traveled. These days I get a lot of recommendations from clients even, they've done a trip somewhere and they say, oh, you haven't done a trip here, you need to do this. And just generally I'm always looking out for places that aren't overrun, that aren't mobbed with the tripod wielding hordes or other massive tour buses or whatever. And just to give you one example, like Iceland, for instance, which is tremendously popular, both for photo trips and all sorts of just general sightseeing tourism. It's gotten to the point where I pretty much won't take people to the coast of Iceland, especially the south coast, because it's just too busy. But what we are doing is four-wheel drive overland trips into the interior, where you can be out all day and not see anyone else. So those are the places that sort of call to me personally, places where you can be out in sort of a vast landscape, where you've got a lot of freedom of movement, and just let the sort of the creative drive guide you without having to negotiate people who are in your way or that sort of thing. Which is why, for instance, one of my favorite places these days is the country where my wife is from, which is Kyrgyzstan, or the Kyrgyz Republic, where we do a trip every summer. And it's just a phenomenal place to travel. The logistics are tricky, but not insurmountable. And the clients who have been with us just have had a phenomenal time. And it's immensely rewarding photographically. I think that it's pretty much world class in terms of mountain landscapes and that sort of thing. The culture is wonderful. People are very warm and welcoming. And usually when I tell people that my wife is from Kyrgyzstan or mention that we do a trip there, they say, Kurdistan? You're going to Kurdistan?
Yeah.
But we actually, the U.S. actually had a major air base there supporting our activities in Afghanistan, a large military cargo air base, basically based out of their international airport, which was there for 11 or 12 years or something like that. And most people in the U.S. have no idea we had a presence there at all. But it's a great place to travel. It's a former Soviet republic, and there's certain aspects of that which are actually very positive, and one of which is that in part because of the official, the official atheism of the Soviet state, there wasn't a lot of attention drawn to religion. So the Kyrgyz people traditionally are majority Muslim, and of course there were Russian Orthodox Russians living there and that sort of thing. And they were basically all treated the same, and so they don't really have any sort of politicized religion there. And it's not a scary place. You wouldn't begin to compare it to Afghanistan, politically or that sort of thing. It's a totally different kind of place, and I don't know, a great place to travel. But those are the kinds of places we're looking for, and also just we look for ways to do trips that might be to more established places, but we try to find ways to do it that are unique, that are special, that really maximize the photographic potential and the overall quality of the experience.
That sounds like a lot of work. You do all that yourself, or you got a staff to do it for you, or?
We have a very small staff. So it's me and my wife and our director of operations, who works remotely and is just a genius and a wonderful person who is extremely capable and talented. And I won't tell you her name because somebody will hire her away from me. Anyway. Yeah, we also have partners who we work with on location in certain countries and that sort of thing. Obviously, there's not always a need to reinvent the wheel if there's somebody else who's got the wheel and it works just fine. So, I think that's the trick, is building those relationships and finding people who you trust, who have similar values in terms of wanting to really produce a great trip and sort of exceed people's expectations and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I admire you for that. Again, looking through your photos, I wasn't sure how you ended up in Kyrgyzstan, and so now that's a little bit clearer, but you definitely end up in some way off the beaten path locations.
I said, let's hear it for off the beaten path locations. There aren't enough of them. But actually, there are tons of places, right here in the U.S. that are, often, they may be right in the vicinity of one of these iconic spots that's mobbed with, people with tripods. And yet, because it's 300 feet off of a paved surface or maybe a little farther into the backcountry, is totally either unknown or sort of or little visited, that sort of thing. So just as much, we were talking about Zion earlier, just as much as Zion has become mobbed, there are other places like the San Rafael Swell, also in Utah, that is very quiet and equally beautiful. And I think it's just people get a little too focused on these iconic scenes, like Tunnel View at Yosemite or Mesa Arch or Delicate Arch, or they think too much about getting a photograph of the object from the spot they've seen it photographed from before, and that sort of thing. So they figure out, they go online and they find the GPS coordinates, or they buy a book on photographing the Southwest or something and figure out, exactly how to be, where to be when, to make the same picture that 1,000 other people have already made, and they post it on social media and feel like they've done a great job if their picture looks just as good as everyone else's. When what I would encourage people to do is just trust yourself and your own vision and go out and look at the world and find what you respond to, and find your own images. I think that is something that we all ought to encourage, for the sake of sort of self-creative satisfaction, but also because it just helps distribute this footprint of impact over a much broader area, so that you don't have these small areas that are heavily impacted by people who want to just see the same old shot.
Yeah. Well, for most people, I think that's fairly difficult, unless you've got a pretty good income and can travel to remote places and that sort of thing. But for the average photographer, some some of them don't even get out of their home state, let alone travel to any place semi-remote in the United States. So,
yeah. Well, I think that's a very good point, and but I think that another thing that it's good to remind ourselves of is that you don't have to travel halfway around the world to make great photographs. And in fact, I have a lecture I do where I sort of finish it off with a set of images that were all made either here in Washington, D.C., where I live, or even in our own home. That you really can't tell where they are. They're sort of abstract or just very designy kinds of pictures. And they're the kind of thing that you can do just about anywhere, if you sort of keep your eyes open and sort of stay open creatively. That's one of the wonderful things about photography is how, it's about sharing your experience of the world with others, whatever that experience happens to be. And you can always find something amazing everywhere.
Very true. Well, let's wrap up by telling everyone where they can find you and your photos and workshops and all the stuff that you do.
Sure. Well, Visionary Wild can be found online at visionarywild.com. That's where our workshops and expeditions. We do things like raft trips down the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon, all the way to Antarctic trips on small vessels to overland, four-wheel drive overland trips in various places. My online print portfolio and information about upcoming events, things like that, is at justinblackphoto.com. And I periodically have articles coming out in Outdoor Photographer, and I'm on Facebook and Instagram as well. Should be pretty easy to find there. But anyway, that's probably, if you Google me, you'll find me.
Yeah, I didn't have any problem anyway. Well, Justin, thanks for being on. It's been great fun talking to you, and I appreciate your time.
I said likewise, Kirby. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So this podcast is published on the 15th and 30th of each month. So thanks for listening, and bye for now, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.